so much for joining us this evening and coming out of your warm homes into the cold. The motion that stands before the House this evening is that this House regrets the yassification of the queer movement. But firstly, I'd like to extend a really warm welcome to you all. We are the St Andrews Union Debating Society, the oldest and some might say finest of its kind.
Yeah!
We're going to do that again because that was crap, except for Owen. Welcome to the St Andrews Union Debating Society, the oldest and some might say finest of its kind.
Yeah!
Yes, that's what we want. As I said, tonight's motion is that this House regrets the yassification of the queer movement. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you two of my very good friends speaking this evening. On the proposition, we have Parth Pandya. And on the opposition, we have Niamh Weir. However, before we begin tonight's debate, I would like to invite our Speaker Secretary to read last week's minutes in the style of a woman phoning into Wendy Williams' radio station.
Hello. I'm having some problems with my husband. He just doesn't want to be intimate with me anymore.
Denial is a river in Egypt. Your husband is gay.
This is such an old week. Can we please move on?
There seems to be some disagreement in the House. We shall have to take a vote by oral acclamation. Every week. All those in favour of taking the minutes as read, say aye.
Aye.
All those against, nay?
Nay.
It seems rather close. I shall have to consult with my sergeant.
Aye.
Aye? The minutes are taken as read.
Resign.
Like me. Right then, without further ado, I would like to invite the first speaker, Parth Pandya, to begin tonight's debate. Hear, hear.
So, this house, what does this house actually mean? We're not talking about Holyrood or Westminster, we're talking about a change that we'd like to see across parliaments up and down, or not up and down, that's the UK, around the world. And what's really important is, if we consider our community in St Andrews as really international, I'm going to be focusing on the global impacts of this motion, because it's not just about the UK, it's about the entire world. So, I'm going to talk about something that's really close to my heart, which is the developing world. I'm going to give you 3 reasons why this should be the most important argument in this debate, before I begin to explain why this is important. The first is on severity. In the developing world, across the developing world, the people that live there, the queer people, have very little rights enshrined. It's very hard for you to be in a relationship with another queer person. It's very hard for you to get married. And these are the places where the rights are curtailed all the time, and there's massive amounts of repercussions if you are practicing, being queer. But secondly, on vulnerability, a lot of these people who are queer are not out, and they are quote unquote underground, and they lack certain agency. So they are pushed to believe, when they go online to try and find out more about their identity, into a lot of stereotypes that are set by the Western world because of algorithms and things like that. So there's a big movement post-Stonewall to demonise people who have not come out, like it's a bad thing that you've not come out. And that's really translated in the developing world, where there's this pressure or this stigma if you aren't out. So there's all of these behaviours against these people in these countries, but they don't feel like they can have agency in the decisions that they want to make. I'm not saying that people in the developed world, in the UK, USA, are not vulnerable, because there are lots of issues. For example, the Trump administration with trans rights and things like that. But the frequency and intensity of the developed world and how much it's harmed by is something that's important in this debate. But finally, as I've already touched on this, is globalization. Think about K-pops or Spanish telenovelas and how much impact that they've had across the world in creating massive amounts of shifts in how people behave, right? Think about the British Raj in India. You may not know, but before the British Raj came in, and the colonial British Empire came in India, India was really, really accepting towards gay people. But there was lots of homophobia when lots of the British policies came into force in that country. And that means that we don't have just material obligations to these countries, we also have psychological obligations to these countries, which is why this is the most important thing. First of all, I'm going to explain what yassification is and frame out what is not in this debate, because I think that we're going to get confused otherwise. What is yassification? It is not saying yas or queen to your friend on the street. This is really important, because this would exist on either side of the house. Think about things existing before Stonewall, like the Afro-American and Latin American ball culture in New York, right? You would still have family dynamics, feelings of solidarity, roasting each other from, you know, the classic documentary Paris is Burning and things like that. You would still have all of these things. You would still have overwhelming positivity on both sides of the house. This is not what Yassification is. What it is making queer life seem extremely positive, like there is no negative thing, or you should focus on the negative things. It is about co-opting, you know, landmark figures and events into gay culture. For example, the trend that right now, gay Jesus. I mean, I don't know about you, like, you know, editing Jesus's images, you know, to make his skin look great. I don't think in Nazareth there was any concealer or foundation in the first place. So I think that these are the things that we're talking about. But also the magnification of Western tropes, right? So what a queer person may look, act, or sound like is something that Yassification is about. So it's not about, you know, just, you know, the culture aspects of queerness. It's about the magnification of these things. So, this is the point. The queer culture and like a lot of the, you know, communication and catharsis and the things that we, you know, enjoy about queer culture would happen on both sides of the house. We're talking uniquely about things which is an amplification of these effects. Okay, so why is Yassification so successful and why does it permeate into the developing world? There are broadly 4 reasons why this is true. The first is that oftentimes Yassification, and when you're trying to sell a narrative of the social justice movement, needs to apply to the lowest common denominator. It needs to be accessible. So things that are inherent to the queer experience. So for example, you know, acting more feminine, or for example, saying certain words, or like appropriating certain things, right? It needs to be simplified, because think about it, in Western society where these narratives are proliferated, there's like a melting pot of cultures, it's very intersectional, right? So you need to find the things that uniquely are like the most lowest common among everyone. So you often lose a lot of nuance, and that's what makes the algorithms on social media and things like that so powerful, because it has to permeate through all algorithms, because it picks up on your characteristics when it's, you know, what's the word, like giving you the, you know, the reels or TikTok or whatever and things like that. And also, think about it, often people don't want to be negative. They want to be on their phone, they want to look at things that make them laugh, like, you know, I have like, my algorithms is full of dogs, and I think that you wanted things to be light-hearted and joyous, right? So you never ever, in Yassification, focus on the negative things, because that won't get you the amount of traction that you want as, you know, a social media influencer or things like that. So, why is this so problematic? Because of my framing earlier, talking about the vulnerability and severity in these developing countries, often their identities and things like pride, for example, in like Lebanon just got theirs very recently, Beirut Pride and things like that, are often very new, and often because you're afraid of speaking out or being persecuted, because, you know, the government's always monitoring social media in a lot of semi-authoritarian countries, you don't have your own information or like your own social media influences in this space. This causes massive displacement effects where you have a lot of the Western media encroaching in your own algorithms, and you are being forced to listen and like take into account all of this information. And this is really important for the fact that several countries have not had their Stonewall. They're still finding their identity. We know that, you know, Mumbai Pride, Beirut Pride, and, you know, all of the other effects, like all of the other prides like Malaysia, are only starting to get massive traction. So, if this came at a time which is now in the last 5 years or so this has taken place, this has massive path dependency effects, right? Because the amount of material that you have online is always going to be Western. It's hard to displace those things because of the amount of like social media creators on this in the first place. So when you go on social media, it's very hard for you to find things that relate directly to your own experiences, and it's very hard for you to reconcile these identities. So why is this particularly important? You can't yassify a unique cultural experience. So for example, there's this beautiful thing in India called the Hijra population, who are seen as this like third gender, an intersection between class struggle, gender and religion. Unfortunately, like the Western world doesn't have anything as like, you know, as like complicated and so culturally and religiously rooted as this, right? So it's very, very hard for you to compare or yassify things which are just unique, and you can't just like simplify or make this thing into a very positive thing in the first place. Second of all, you can't yassify everything. So I explained the gay Jesus thing. So for example, yassifying religions is very difficult, right? Because there's a snowball effect. Who are actually the gatekeepers of who's making gay Jesus, right? Is that actually religious people that are deciding what gay Jesus should look like in the photoshops that they make of them and all that sort of stuff? Are we actually including religious minorities in that conversation? And there is actually no real, tangible benefit to photoshopping? If you think about it, take a step back and think, is there actually a tangible benefit to photoshopping gay Jesus? And honestly, the answer is no, there's not. And I think that, you know, this just causes massive amounts of backlash from the queer people themselves, who may be religious, but face massive amounts of cognitive dissonance because they're not sure about how to reconcile their identities particularly well. But also this has a massive power dynamic issue, right? If you think about it, if you ask the average person on the street where they think voguing comes from, how many people will say Madonna versus the 20th century African American or Latino ball culture? And a lot of people don't even know about this ball culture that happened, in the early 1990s, about how voguing was a massive part of their identity. But everyone thought it was Madonna because she blew it up into a massive thing in, admittedly, a good song, Vogue. So the average person whose lives are being, perhaps trivialized, but are being amplified, they often don't get a say in the way that it's portrayed, or often don't get, you can't, out of a gallery, you have an artwork and you have a plaque next to it. It's not like you can have a plaque saying where this came from, and that is the most harmful thing about it. And finally, and I think this is the most important thing, you can't yassify bad experiences. So often Pride in a lot of developing countries tends to be a protest. There's lots of placards, they march the streets fighting for gay rights, and it's very different to the Western world where we have it as a celebration, right? I mean, Barclays wouldn't fund a Pride protest because they want to commercialize Pride and things like that. But the very nature of yassification and the way that it proliferates, being a very positive message, means that for a lot of people it's quite insulting, because it's not a good experience if you are being, persecuted in your own country about these things, and you're getting barraged when you're trying to find things that you want to learn about your identity, you want to learn how to reconcile your things, but you get barraged with a massive amount of positive messaging. That doesn't feel good for someone whose life is not doing too well. So this is why yassification causes bad effects. But let me talk about if you regret something, so this house regrets, what would we have on our side instead if we would regret this? So even if you think yassification is good, if Niamh, and I'm sure she will do a good job of convincing you as to the good parts of yassification, I want to explain why, even if you think it's good, why you should still side with the proposition in this motion. Because the comparative, or something, the government side of the house is one in which we would stand for there being a mix of Western and non-Western tropes that proliferate. Note that the reason why we can claim this on our side is because of the reasons I gave you as to why it's so widespread when it's just coming from a yassified Western lens, right? And when we get rid of that, when we regret it and we ask for something else to take its place, the volume and type of content that exists would be lower, right? Because obviously when you have newer pride movements coming up through the developing world, they come at different speeds and different times, right? So often what this will allow you to do is that if you're able to start to find out more about your identity, you may feel more comfortable being online, and this will allow you to enter sort of the gap in the market that wouldn't exist with yassification, right? If we regretted it, then maybe an indigenous or a native social media influencer, which we're getting a lot of right now actually, would be able to combat the massive saturation that exists in the market when it comes to Western yassified tropes, right? Which allows you to have more of a growing fan base much quicker for those more indigenous experiences. And this is really important, right? A lot of people reconcile their identity between being, religious and gay, for example, from forums where they find like-minded people like them, through seeing, TV shows like Drag Race Philippines, where you see lots of LGBT drag queens on there who explain in the workroom their experiences between their parents and their identity, or their religion if they are religious. Christianity is really big in the Philippines. So this allows you to have more of these experiences more often on the government side of the house. But think about what I said earlier, is that on the opposition side of the house, the status quo, you would have massive amounts of saturation, and this is really irreversible, because once you start realizing that maybe you can't, because you don't have enough information about it, that you can't reconcile your identities, you feel like religion and being queer can't go together, you tend to self-destruct, or you tend to shut yourself away from other people. And that initial step, that first couple of searches on Google that you do, really inform the way in which you enter the queer landscape. And this is the sort of things that we need to focus on our side of the house, getting into the diversity, which is why this is a really important argument. But also, I would just be happy not having any yassification at all, because often grassroots activism, you know, is quite successful and often very easy and cost effective. Everyone is like, oh, but there's a massive institution, which means that they will persecute you, and like they have massive state control and things like that, which is true. But often the most common thing that queer people want in developing countries is validation, acceptance of their feelings, and comfort and understanding for people that are like them, not having cognitive dissonance. So removing yassification, removing the social media aspect of it, but maybe having more conversations on the ground, even if you're not able to have legislative change in whatever semi-authoritarian body you are in, is still massively important to these individuals, and that is something that I think you'll get more of on our side of the house. So, queer movements need to prioritise representation rather than yassification. Because you know what? RuPaul's Drag Race, Queer Eye, all of these things would exist on both sides of the house. You would still have the production of these things as well. Often queer people rely upon their chosen families, their chosen friends, and their chosen communities, right? And they rely upon, you know, online information about how to reconcile their identities, as I've just said. But if you have to opt into yassification, so for example, you have to have the stigma of coming out, or being forced to come out, if you have to opt into Western tropes of how to be gay and things like that, that's when you get stigmatized and shunned, right? Because if being gay is often about your community, and every member of your community is telling you, no, you should do this or you should do that, because that's what yassification says, then you're not going to feel a part of those chosen families that you've created. So we should prioritize and focus on allowing people to have equal access to information, having Western and non-Western tropes, and allowing them to opt in and out for experimentation between different things and different beliefs, right? And reconciling your identity is a long journey, but it's those initial things that you see online which shape that journey and are really, really important. So I think that is why this is the most important thing in the debate. When you are listening to the rest of the debate and through your floor speeches, think very carefully about severity. Think very carefully about the rights that are enshrined in these areas. Think about how vulnerable these groups are, and also that we all have a part to play in the globalization of these Western tropes to these areas, which we don't know whether they would have consented into these things or not in the first place. That is why this is so important. These people have the least amount of rights, and therefore I urge you to propose this motion.
Parth for that very fine speech, and now cross and invite Niamh Weir to continue the debate. Hear, hear.
Sorry, good start.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for the invitation. Having been a member of the Society since I started at university, it's exciting not only to take the stand to debate tonight, but also to speak about something that's really close to my heart as a young queer person. I think something that you'll probably notice tonight is that me and Parth have a lot of the same ground. I think we agree fundamentally about the queer community and movements, but we do disagree about other aspects, why we're debating. And I think that's testament to the inherently accepting and diverse nature of our community. I think it's important to stay accountable and adapt in the face of an ever-changing world and its new challenges, and to assess whether the movement is serving those which belong to it. With that being said, I fundamentally do believe that the yassification of the queer movement has had great impacts on shaping the community today, and more broadly working towards the societal progression that we benefit from, and also the societal progression that we aim for tomorrow. Now, before we start, I think it's important that we pause to consider some of the terminology, and I tell you kind of largely what that terminology means to me in this speech today. So the word yes, I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson, courtesy of Urban Dictionary. The word yes, with one S, was largely used in 1980s America by queer people of colour, largely in underground queer scenes and largely in drag circles. It was a way for them to lift each other up, and it was popularised through drag culture and mainstream media, which we see now with, I'm sure everyone's seen the video with Lady Gaga, and it's like, yes, queen. So to the point where I think like anyone under 25 is familiar with yes with the double S. It conveys a sense of positivity. To yassify something is to make something over the top, glamorous, or even gayer, as some may say. I think the yassification of the movement refers to its flamboyancy, its open-armed approach, its diversity, its saying yes to things, and its saying no to no one. I think, put simply, yes comes from yes. It's an encouragement, a positivity, and in many ways, a protest for people who have too often been told no. I think it refers to unapologetic drag queens, celebratory parades, but also smaller moments of expression that are rooted in joy. Now, the word regret, what does this mean, and what are its implications? It necessitates that we not only look at the movement that exists today, but the trajectory that got us here. The foundational bold strides of the Pride movement are deeply entangled with this sense of yassification. For the first movements of visibility and rights, being bold and courageous was essential, and we can see that in the movement's history and the foundational steps that got us to the privilege that we hold today. I would go as far as to say that without the bold strides that came before us, from queer individuals who were bold enough to break the mold when it was dangerous to do so, we wouldn't be able to have the open conversation that we're having today. And I think that's a privilege that we fundamentally lose track of too much. I think this progress, it also makes it impossible for me to say that we should regret these strides or the form that they took. Now more than ever is the wrong time to backtrack on this open-minded and unapologetic tone. The movement is for everyone, and it's important we welcome people, regardless of how they identify or present, with a strong yes or yes. Hattie. So firstly, I wanted to talk about a little bit of yassification as a celebration of queer joy and expression. So I think celebrating queer joy is fundamentally a form of protest. I think in a world where being queer has always and probably will always be at least a little bit challenging, it is a form of protest to embrace the joy that you're able to experience as a result of it. The movement has fundamentally been rooted in resilience and resistance since its beginning, but it has also strived at every step to celebrate the creativity, humour and diversity in the community. By centering joy, queer individuals assert that their identities are not just about survival, but about thriving. Yassification defies narratives that reduce queerness to tragedy or struggle. When we see queer culture expressed in such yassified forms, we are witnessing an assertion of selfhood against decades of oppression and struggle. Queer people are complex. We experience more than one emotion, and it is okay for us to say the world is a difficult place and we face these challenges, but we are also able to embrace our culture and heritage in a way that is also equally as productive and bold to say. Yassification is not a distraction from serious activism, but rather a reminder that joy and expression are essential parts of the liberation the movement fights for. Accepting yourself is one step and embracing yourself is a next. There is a power in turning shame and fear into joy, and there are very real impacts of this on our mental health and our ability to progress the movement. What's the use of acceptance if that acceptance necessitates that people have to tone down their queerness or conform to a societally acceptable ideal? I think it's a dangerous idea to say that we reject this form of queerness and we accept another. It's a slippery slope. Once we start saying that we regret the yassification or a specifically flamboyant form of it, then what other standards are we setting upon each other? For a movement that is fundamentally defined upon striving to get rights for the most vulnerable, we cannot have this exceptionalism in our conversations with each other. Fundamentally, it feels wrong for a community to police the expression of its members insofar as it harms no one else. You don't, become queer and then you're handed a feather boa and instructed to act in a certain way. Every queer person is different, which is why it's such a beautifully diverse community. And we can't start saying to people, your expression of self is okay and yours isn't, because all that leads to is more division and hierarchy, which is not what we need. And fundamentally, the yassification of the movement was an organic step that occurred when people felt free to be themselves boldly. For so long, yassification wasn't a privilege that they had. They couldn't go out into the streets bold in what they were wearing or saying or acting. They had to constantly watch themselves because they were in very real danger. And I think, how can we regret this organic step when it happened as a result of such a hard and long fight for freedom? Okay, I want to talk a little bit about how we create community through this shared expression. So the yassification of the queer movement has only paved the way for freer self-expression and more accepting community spaces. It inherently progresses the idea that regardless of how one presents or identifies, they are welcome and embraced. The experience of being queer is challenging and sometimes lonely. It's an identity that is constantly in struggle and opposition with forces outside of our control. I think every queer person knows at least a little bit what it feels like to feel alone, unlistened to. Even the best support network in the world isn't reassuring when you know that some people will not like you just because of this unchangeable truth about yourself. Don't we deserve to have a little fun and find belonging in people that understand us, a welcoming community amongst this struggle? The Yassified movement tells us that there's no right way to be queer and that we can feel free to push the limits in our expression. And I think that's something that we ultimately can't say no to. Sorry, dramatic pause. We can even see in our small town the importance of celebratory events in making people feel welcome and valued. I myself am not usually considered visually queer. I've been questioned many times on my identity, and despite now having been in an openly queer relationship for almost 3 years, hi Bonnie, I still face critiques that I'm too feminine, confused, or simply a phase. I'm sure many queer people can relate. To me, the Yassified movement celebrates femininity and self-expression in queer culture, and states that regardless of your appearance, you're welcome. There are no limits, and the limits that there are constantly being pushed and challenged. The spaces and friendships that I have been welcomed into as a result of such an open culture have been invaluable. I met my partner almost 3 years ago at the St Andrews Drag Race, would highly recommend, it's great fun, and have undoubtedly benefited from other group celebrations of queer joy when it came to embracing my own identity. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the power of accessibility and mainstream visibility. So to reflect a little bit on when I was asked to speak, like probably many of you, the terminology of the motion stumped me slightly, and I turned to Urban Dictionary more than I'd like to admit. It's a lot. I was on the phone to my lovely Nana, who for reference is a classic Christian Highland woman, when she asked me what I was debating. I paused and thought to myself, God, how do I even begin? Yassification, queer, will she know what any of this means before telling her this motion? But I hadn't given her enough credit. What I had forgotten about my Nana is that she lives alone up north on the coast and loves her Netflix subscription. She can't work Google, won't accept an email address, but boy does she love Bridgerton. Luckily for me, my Nana has seen not only several seasons of Queer Eye, countless episodes of The Ellen Show, and is a Modern Family fanatic. If you're not clued up on queer pop culture, where have you been? These are all positive portrayals of queer people in the media, in particularly Yassified forms. So sure, she didn't know what Yassification meant, but neither did I. But she did, on a broader sense, know what I was talking about. And I think that is the mainstream understanding and acceptance that was fought so hard to gain. I think the very fact that a woman in her 70s, in a small Scottish town, isolated from many of the social hubs of the movement, understands and empathizes with its struggles and goals is testament to how much queer people have sought to be included and embraced in mainstream culture and the success that we have achieved. I think Yassification inherently magnifies queer culture in individuals, whether that's through media, art, or even everyday life. The whole of the population is not only exposed, but invited to share in the joy of the movement. Queer issues are projected to the mainstream, and in so doing, queer issues become people issues. There is sometimes a glamorization of when the queer movement was more underground and exclusive, or grassroots. But I think this is wrong. What this neglects to remember is that out with these limited spaces, which in themselves were often exclusionary to marginalised groups, or those that understood the movement more, people were fighting for the privilege that we now have, a privilege that we simply can't regret. We need to consider the alternative. A movement without expression, a movement without acceptance, a movement without a voice. This permeation of queer culture into pop culture is fantastic for representation. For young people, they are able to see people that look and feel like them on TV, in books, in music, embracing their identity. That is priceless. This allows young people to have role models that promote self-acceptance. Seeing queer joy in these formats combats the loneliness and fear that come with non-accepting environments and the struggle of coming to terms with your identity. This is huge for combating loneliness and self-doubt in young members of the LGBTQ+ community. Further though, it fosters broader societal acceptance. Someone who is regularly exposed to queer individuals through the media they consume is more likely to understand the movement and have more positive associations with it. Someone may have never met a queer person, but if they're exposed to it regularly through, for example, a TV show, They will naturally be less shocked and more accepting if they happen upon same-sex parents at the school gates, or if one day their child comes out to them. These are very real-world impacts of having queer people embraced and accepted in the mainstream in this yassified form. It's the fierce forms of expression on big platforms that won us mainstream acceptance in the first place. And the visibility and awareness that has come from this can only be a good thing when it comes to tackling these issues. History shows us the triumphs that have come from queer individuals bravely and proudly paving new paths for acceptance. A particularly striking example, I think, in respect to this motion, is that of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Riviera, who opened the Star House in 1972. I'm sure many of you are familiar, but it was a shelter for gay and trans street kids. They provided food, shelter, clothing, and emotional support to countless kids who needed it, all the while selling their bodies in able to fund this effort. It was the ultimate sacrifice, and they themselves participated in many marches until in 1973 they were banned from the New York City Pride Parade, as the committee had decided that they were no longer allowing drag queens, as they were giving the movement a bad name. It is this sense of division and hierarchy that tears the movement apart. Fundamentally, there should be no sense of hierarchy in a movement defined by its fight for equality. Yassification has only led to more acceptance, more inclusivity, and more diversity, and I'm never going to argue against that. Fundamentally, a yassified movement is a loud movement, and now is not the time to be silent. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Niamh for her very fine speech, and indeed both of our speakers for what has been a really interesting debate on both sides of the House this evening. Of the evening when we open up the debate to the floor. What that means for those of you who haven't been to one of our public debates before is that anybody in attendance can stand and speak. To catch the eye of the chair, which is myself, please raise your hand. You stand if you're able, and you can speak this evening for up to 3 minutes, because normally we have a 2v2. Today we've got a 1v1, so we've got lots of time to hear your thoughts. You can pose a question, you can share with us your ideas, you can play devil's advocate, you can ask questions to the speakers themselves, pick apart their speeches, anything that you like really. So 3 minutes to speak and you'll be cut off by the gavel. To let you know, we also do a prize, or 2 prizes really, for our floor speech. So not only do you win the teeny tiny trophy, ooh, teeny tiny trophy, you also win a £15 voucher to Toppings bookstore this week, so very coveted. So any speeches from the floor this evening? Bonnie, yes.
I'm Denise Parth. So I want to address government. When I say, when you talk about the negative effect on third world countries of the yassification of the movement, I just wanted to question this, as it seems as if you're suppressing some forms of queer expression and trying to play respectability politics in who is allowed to express themselves, and particularly for more feminine people, that seems like it will negatively affect them. I just wanted to ask what your response to that is.
Okay, thank you to Bonnie. Other speeches from the floor? Yes, at the back. Please stand and state your name for the minutes.
Callie Cassidy. This is for the proposition. First, just on the point of the focus on something that's incredibly niche, I think far from the forefront of an actual queer movement, such as gay Jesus. I think you failed to read this as an act of subversion for possibly victimized queer youth in communities such as the rural American South that have these enshrined Western rights that are quickly slipping away under an increasingly more conservative government. And on this point of joy as an act of liberation that the opposition has brought up, I think that there's an increasing weak point in the proposition where you say something is like, yassification is not a good experience for those who are in more struggling, less enshrined places in the world. I think you have missed upon the point that this yassification, which has its sources in movements that you cite, such as ballroom culture in New York in the 70s and 80s, and even in the 60s as well, existed in also places that had extreme acts of violence, police raids, police brutality, and that is an act of liberation and activism. It is the forefront of the movement, and how these have set the blueprints that have been repeatedly and like enshrined in the narratives and in the literature and in the archives that we have on how to construct a movement in a place where there isn't one. I think that this act of queer joy and this magnification of symbols that we can touch upon as a community in opposition to of narratives about queer despair and this kind of violence that they face is important to touch upon when you say we shouldn't rely on it.
Thank you to Kelly. Other speeches from the floor? Yes, just here. Please stand and state your name for the minutes. Yes.
For the minutes, I'm Niamh Weir. Now, when it comes to LGBT stuff and queerness, I've got a bit of a weird background. I've come from a very religious upbringing. My father's a minister in the Salvation Army, although have always at home been told, yes, if you ever come out gay or anything like that, I'll always support you. Now, I only realised I was bisexual before coming to university. Last week, I think. But so when it comes to points such as the Yassification and gay Jesus, just as one point to bring up quickly. So from my perspective as a LGBT Christian, although I do think I sometimes find the idea of old gay Jesus a bit of a laugh or whatever, I do think there is that intentionally making a link between sort of a common religious trope such as that and pride can be very important. For example, anyone who's using a Salvation Army uniform, I'm wearing a pride pin with that as a matter of principle, unless I've forgotten or lost it somewhere, which is always likely. Now, when it comes to the Yassification of the queer movement, although there are obviously the benefits of it, yes, greater acceptance, it allows for people who do not conform to societal standards to feel more accepted. From my experiences as someone who has spent the last couple of years trying to come to terms with their own bisexuality, you do feel that idea of, oh, am I queer enough? Am I bisexual enough? Because the idea of this yassified community where everyone's like, yes, here I am, I'm a queer man, I am in love with other men, etc., which is amazing and beautiful and perfect in so many ways. And then here I am thinking, yes, I do feel attraction to men, but I also really feel attracted to women, and I'm really wanting to get a girlfriend. In fact, the only thing that allowed me to come to terms with my bisexuality was the fact that I got a girlfriend. Because I didn't have to worry, oh, will people assume that I'm actually just a gay man still half in the closet, etc., etc. Because I was able to say, right, okay, I found a relationship where that is accepted. With my girlfriend who's also bisexual, and I didn't have to worry about whether other people thought I was queer enough because I found someone who did. I'm not doing my rest of my time for the house.
Thank you for sharing that, Miss Caden, and congratulations on coming out to your parents as well. Moving on to other speeches from the floor. Yes, just here. Please stand and state your name for the minutes.
My name is Niamh. Thank you to both sides for what have been extremely eloquent and educational speeches. I think one of the interesting things that we've addressed so far in this motion is like the sociological phenomenon of queerness, but it's been not what I was expecting, divorced from the more like incorporation of social movements in general to like capitalistic frameworks. So what I assume I was gonna like hear coming into it was like, nothing used to make me more frustrated as a queer person when you'd see like Chick-fil-A or like all of these like huge like monolithic MNCs be like, oh my god, we love for people, and then like the owners would just donate donate millions of dollars to like charities for like conversion. It's like, oh, so like which side are we actually choosing? So I was going to ask both sides if it might be worth exploring the ways in which social movements are forced to adapt, as Niamh says, to the conditions of the time in which they're operating. The ways in which other enterprises outside of the movement are able to commodify that in ways in which is very tokenistic and frustrating to constituents of the movement, and also just kind of like very depressing to witness the ways in which people's pain can be conformed for other ideas. And my other questions for the opposition, I went, unlike a lot of people, or maybe most Americans who are queer, I went to a school where there's a very prevalent culture of queerness. And paradoxically, I always found that the yassifying tendencies of my friends who were queer also became very exclusive, as the speaker before me mentions, that it's very difficult if you are not the kind of queer person that embodies exactly what the yassified image is. How queer are you? And is that queerness that you have, this thing that is so central to your identity, how much is that actually really valuable? It becomes a really difficult thing to grapple with in this community, which is supposed to be so accepting, which is supposed to honor you and is supposed to make you feel better, but ends up also being exclusionary. So it might be another interesting question for the rest of the round. The ways in which these phenomenons can seem super accepting on the outside, but then when tasked by individuals, the ways in which it can be used to actually bring people down.
Okay, thank you very much to Niamh. Any other speeches from the floor? Owen?
Okay, technical question, debate question for Parth. Okay, you claim path dependency as a mechanism by which we end up having one consolidated narrative which pushes down all others. However, is this not a tension with your counterfactual being a mix of narratives rather than one single consolidated narrative that's westernized? Insofar as presumably your path dependency mechanism is also going to achieve one consolidated westernized narrative on the counterfactual, particularly when the mechanisms of social media algorithms and Western soft power are symmetric.
I hope you tracked that. Okay, any other speeches from the floor? Anyone not on board, we'll come back to board later on. We've got lots of time, there's a £15 voucher at stake. Okay, Alex?
Owen will love you, but please keep your weird BP stuff face. Now, I wish that everyone was as accepting as Niamh is. You're absolutely right. There should be no such thing as a right way to do queer and a wrong way to do queer. Though, weirdly enough, I have been in such a fight where someone was accusing me of doing queer wrong, believe it or not. And it really points to what Parth said, that the yassification of the movement has led to, especially in the Western world, a very specific mold. A mold of, what queer people are supposed to look like and act like. Oh, my favorite phrase, yeah, but you're not gay, And ultimately, this has damaged the movement, because the movement, which should be the movement, and should be aiming at liberation and us being accepted everywhere, has splintered now. We have conservative gays, we have religious gays, queer people. I was putting it in my context, apologies. All of these, political parties even have their own LGBTQ groups. When, by the way, I recently found out that the Conservative Party's LGBTQ group is called, deep breath, LGBT Tory. Heaven's sake. So this whole process of literally, it has imposed a hierarchy on that there is a way to do queer, is actively damaging the cause, and it can fit into the larger context that we do see now of social movements splintering. We do not need that, and we need a far more unifying approach to the whole thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Alex. Let's go to Mia.
I would just like to add another layer to the conversation here about how the queer movement ought to sort of best support people who are involved within it. Because I think while conversations about individual experiences within the movement are incredibly important, given this is something which the movement exists to facilitate, equally as important is the ways in which the movement is able to gain support for legislative or societal change which enables queer people within societies to be best supported. That's where I'd like to speak in defence of the government team, because I think that the ways in which we see yassification tends towards trivialisation in some capacities, where people look towards movements like Pride or look towards the queer movement in general and trivialise the ways in which it is fighting to achieve equality, because they say that it looks more like a party than a protest, for example. And these are all sorts of things that yassification has brought about for this movement. So while obviously the experiences of individuals with the movement are likely the most important thing in this round, given that they are, as both teams have accepted, an incredibly vulnerable group, what is the most important for these people is clearly creating a society in which they can be themselves and they can be welcomed and accepted for who they are. And only by creating a movement which is clear in its aims and isn't something which can can be sort of brushed aside or trivialised by the societies that it operates within? Are we able to get those societal changes where people are truly accepted? So perhaps a level of conversation about how yassification can sometimes go hand in hand with the trivialisation of important context is an important thing for this round. Thank you.
Thank you very much to me. Other speeches from the floor? Jamie?
Yeah, I'd like to, so for minutes, I'm Jamie, and I'd like to quickly talk a bit about the world in which we've created, in which we're discussing this debate. And I think very much the debate has remained within the confines of an ideal world or a perfect world in which everyone's working towards a common goal. And indeed, whilst in this room, I think we can most likely safely assume that at least to some extent we're working towards an inclusive and a safe future for everyone. That's not necessarily the case in a world with 7.5 billion people. And I like very much what some of the floor speakers were saying before me, in that we must start to consider how best to move the world towards this more safe and inclusive future. And indeed, creating a trivialized and sometimes quite simplistic or oversimplistic, but I must also mention can be seen as extreme. Can be seen as extreme form of the queer movement can be interpreted by particularly more conservative movements. I'm going to leave the Western world for a second, like Parth mentioned at the beginning of their speech, in some less developed and even more conservative countries. That can be seen as an active wall and hindrance to progressing the queer movement in positive and progressive ways. And much like the mistake that I made at the beginning of the debate by putting this House regrets the yassification of the queer movements, I almost think, instead of the queer movement, I almost think that the yassification in and of itself is what is creating an us versus them culture. It's creating this idea of the queer movements, this unity, and it's pulling people apart. Whether you're in the queer movement or like me, not in the queer, whether you're in the queer community or like me, not in the queer community, it does create a more, I feel like it creates a more divisive and more polarized world, which, if we're going to take a more utilitarian view, is much more difficult to progress change. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to Jamie. Any other speeches from the floor? Yeah, Ariel?
This is going to be very brief and just to kind of follow up on what was saying. As the person responsible for Alex's interaction with an individual about doing gay right or wrong, there is this concern that there's this packaged image of what liberation looks like coming out of certain circles. And I think following every single point that's been made recently, what matters is equality for all and what that means for the opportunity to be open in whatever way that suits you and whatever sector. And I think it's just a concern with how yassification's developed that this House regrets is that it's being utilised in a way where it's gone from pop culture and empowering, like Niamh so eloquently said, to being used as a way to unintentionally exclude its own people. And I just would like kind of the House to remember that what we're saying is not the culture that's come out of this is bad, we're saying the use of the culture is the problem. Thank you.
Time for a couple of more speeches from the floor. Any questions for our speakers? None?
What's your favorite color?
I can include that.
Okay, yeah. Okay, in which case I think we will come back to the table. We go in reverse order, so we'll be starting with Niamh. Thank you all very much for your contributions from the floor this evening. We'll announce who has won the Best Floor Speech Prize at the end of the debate, along with the winner of the debate itself. I think normally we have 10 minutes each to reply, but I think I'll cut you off at 15, considering how much time we have.
15?
Yeah, why not? There's a lot to respond to.
More than 10.
Huh?
That's more than 10.
Yeah, normally you have 10, but yeah. You don't have to speak for that amount of time, but knowing you both, I think you can. Okay, wonderful. I'd like to invite Niamh Weir.
My favourite colour is purple, thank you for asking. I think that'll be the easiest one of the night. So a couple different points to touch on. I'm going to start by talking about the third world, because I think this is a really important thing that I haven't really interacted with yet, that I think, I need to tackle. I think the key thing that I think queer people aren't going anywhere. And I think as important as it is for people in the third world to progress up to a kind of modern standard and to get the rights that we so desperately want them to get, we still can't say to queer people, you can't express yourselves in a significant way or in the way that feels best to you. I still think that that's something that we can't do. I think even if it did, I think the benefits of having that expression for people in the third world, where they're able to escape from that kind of oppressive environment and envision a different life by seeing positive representation in the media, I think that's a benefit that we take over that. I think further, I think the the alternative is that we have a solely political queer movement. I think for people in the third world, like, queer people are always, to some extent, going to be demonized if that's how their government decides to view them, if that's how their culture decides to view them. I think that's something that we can't change on either side of the debate. What we can change is how we portray these people as people. I think by having these people in the mainstream media, we're able to create more positive perceptions of them. I think for non-members of the community, perceiving and understanding the humanity of queer people is vital to change. I think if we ever want them to respect them as human beings and to have equal rights, then we need to allow them to see those people as full, developed people. I think the comparative here is that we either get a solely political characterization of, like, look at these terrible people that are just constantly campaigning for rights and wanting change and protesting and protesting and protesting, and the comparative is that we get a joyful portrayal. We get to see the real life. I don't think yassification always has to be positive. I think representation allows people, as you said, in Drag Race, they talk about their experiences, whether they're negative or positive. They showcase that. They make people feel seen. They make people feel heard. And I think for the individual level in these third world countries, they're still able to engage with that media to some extent where that is reassuring to a level where that is beneficial for their mental health. For a second extent, number two, it amplifies the projection of queer people in a culture where they're not able to be visible otherwise. I think the privilege of someone in the Western world to be able to go on TV and showcase themselves to the third world is a privilege that people in the third world don't have. And so the comparative here is that we're able to take someone with that privilege and showcase it so that people become desensitized, they become used to it, because at the end of the day, a country's human rights levels are subject to change, valid to social pressure. Governments are people. Governments are in complex business exchanges where eventually we'd hope there's going to be some kind of trade-off where they're going to need to modernise in order to participate. I think further, I think reverting to a portrayal of queer people of only being about politics and policy doesn't humanise these people. It doesn't give these people the complexity they deserve. It gives opposition the chance to, doesn't give them the chance to see or understand the everyday life and emotions of queer people. These two forms of representation, both the protest and the joy, must come in conjunction to bridge political gaps and allow queer people to be respected and perceived as complex individuals. Yassification isn't only positive. Yassification means representation. I think this kind of leads on to my second point, which is, am I queer enough? Okay, I'm a queer individual. I relate to this heavily. I think, again, I didn't kind of realise that I was queer until I was about 17. And then I struggled with that significantly because nothing in my life up to that point had made me think that that would be the case. And then it shifted my identity and how I thought about the world in a completely different way. And my interactions with the world, I've constantly felt as if, am I gay enough to talk about this? Am I queer enough? Even being in an almost 3-year relationship, I'm thinking, do I have the experience or the expertise because I don't fit the mold? But I do not think that we should regret the work that people who have came before us have progressed for. I think to regret the yassification is to regret the groundwork that led us to have the rights and the representation that we have today. And I think that is something that I simply won't trade off. Do I agree that we need more unification in the queer community? Of course. Do I agree that the queer community can sometimes be exclusionary? Of course. Do I think that means that we need to reject all of the long, decades of work by drag queens and bold queer individuals to pave the way for rights and for reform? No. I think that those things just don't, I think those things are not mutually exclusive. I think we can campaign for more inclusivity in the queer community. I think that's already happening as our vision of what a queer person looks like expands to accept more kind of different interpretations and presentations. I think that's coming with society. However, I think to reject the whole of the yassification of the queer movement is to reject all of that important work by drag queens, all of that important work by queer individuals in the 80s and 90s, and I think that that's something that we can't do, because I personally think that their efforts were so important in paving the way for today, and I think that yassification is unintangible with that. I think if we didn't have them, we wouldn't be here today, and I think that that's something that we're not acknowledging. I think I prefer a world in which we have this yassification, this open embracement of other people in different cultures and different lives and different interpretations. I think that's really, really important. I think that is more convincing to me that I'm going to be able to be free to be myself, because if people can be accepting of pushing the norms, then I'm going to be able to express myself in a similar, if not on a minor scale. I feel like if people are going to be accepting to that, then they're going to be able to transfer that to me. And I think generally I find that a lot of queer people are more accepting to people of different cultures and different backgrounds because they have that experience. They have that. And I think in all honesty, I think yes, it's stressful to feel that insecure way of, am I queer enough to participate in this discourse? Am I queer enough to have this identity? But I also think that we're only going to get unification by not putting other people down. And I think regretting the yassification and regretting and rejecting the identity of countless queer individuals, that is all you're doing. That is creating more and more division, which is not going to lead to this inclusive utopia that you think it is. I think only by embracing people of different presentations are you going to feel freer in your own. Okay, fab. I want to talk a little bit about religion. Okay, I'm someone that also grew up Christian. I'm also someone that came from a family that left our church because they were homophobic when I came out. Something I'm very grateful for. My family are fantastic. But I also think that being queer and being religious is a difficult interplay. I think it's something people struggle with. I think it's a complex cultural thing, and I think that's why that kind of comes out in things like yassified Jesus or whatever. I think that's a lot of the time people's way to process the kind of discrimination and the harm that they've been put through in life. I also think that it's only through this mainstream acceptance that we're going to get more progress for people that want to participate in those circles. It's only when people are desensitized and they understand that queer people exist and should exist, and even if they have bad opinions, to keep them to themselves because they've got a right to exist. That means that when someone comes into their church that doesn't present or doesn't love in the same way that they do, they're not going to fly off the handle. And I think that's an important thing that we have to value. I think that acceptance only comes when we have representation. Fab. I want to talk a little bit about trivialization and this idea that we can oversimplify queer people through this yassification. I don't think this is true. I think a lot of the time, what yassification does is it shows people as it shows queer people as complex. I think queer people can have joy. They can embrace the people that they love. They can embrace the way that they love. They can embrace the way that they identify. And they can also say, hey, this isn't good enough. And I think a lot of the time, the only tangible way for them to get the struggles and the harms that they've suffered to the mainstream population is through yassification of some sort. Whether that looks like going on TV, whether that looks like incorporating that into the plot of a sitcom, whether it means talking about that in an interview, it is a way to project. It is a way to explain to the mainstream the narrative that they already know. I think saying that yassification oversimplifies queer people, but in fact all that yassification does is magnify. It makes them mainstream. It projects it. And I think yassification isn't only positive. I think we've already discussed this. I think both sides have talked about how interpretations of yassification, whether that be, in the kind of most yassified forms of media, like kind of Drag Race, where you get people talking about their struggles. I think, again, struggle is a key component to being queer, and so I think any representation necessarily includes that, just because I think that's part of a key component of your identity when you're queer in the modern world. I also think this kind of leads on to commodification. I think we're in a capitalist society. A lot of things are going to be commodified. But I also accept that a lot of people's intentions in a capitalist society aren't always pure. I don't think that when CEOs get in front of the camera and say that they care about something, that they genuinely care about that. Maybe I'm just not that trusting, but I think that's just how the world works. I think insofar as an organisation is putting up flags in a way that makes customers feel safe, and in a way that an organisation is donating millions and millions of pounds and dollars to queer organisations, I don't care if their heart's in the right place. I don't. What I do care is that the tangible benefits of that on countless and countless queer children and individuals across the world are incredibly valuable. And I think to discount those efforts purely because they're commodified discounts the fact that practically everything that we do in this world is commodified under a capitalist society. If that's the debate that you want to have, sure, sign me up. But I think the comparative here is not whether or not this is not the effect of capitalism. Yeah, I also think it is virtue signalling. A lot of capitalism and commercialization of the queer movement is virtue signalling. It's having t-shirts that saying, I'm a gay dad, or having a flag that says, I'm proud, or, and that's a way. I'm sure a lot of you had that phase where you're like, oh my words, what can I do about this? And then you're like, oh, I can buy a flag. And it's like a really exciting thing, and a way to embrace your identity, and a way to come to terms with yourself. And I think in a way, virtue signalling is effective, because I know that when me and my partner go on holiday somewhere and we see a pride flag, we think, oh, this might be a safe location for us. Or if we go to a restaurant, we can feel safe holding hands because we know that they maybe donated £1 million last month, and so their staff are probably trained in not to harass their customers. I think virtue signalling is important in making queer people in the real world feel safe. And I think that's a trade-off that I'm willing to make for this comparative of commercialization versus this grassroots activism. On that, I think grassroots is a great idea. I think oftentimes grassroots is important, but I think the real world benefits on the individual of grassroots are never going to compare to what we get of this mainstream yassification, which is on popular culture, on TV, on Netflix, on YouTube, on TikTok. You can't get away from it. And I think grassroots isn't going to help someone that's 13 in their bedroom feeling lonely coming to terms with who they are. I think grassroots doesn't have the power to campaign against governments because it's not millions and millions of people that have all watched a show and empathized with a storyline and thought, hey, they should be able to do this, or hey, that's ridiculous. And so I think grassroots, as much as it's a nice idea and as much as it's got these great ideas behind it that I think are key to the spirit of the queer movement, I think we need bigger scale, and we can't regret the bigger scale that we now have, because without that we wouldn't have had the campaigning from popular culture that we've seen that led to the rights today. Fundamentally, regretting the yassification of queer culture isn't just about regretting the kind of minutiae of the daily life that we live. It's also about regretting the progress that led us here today. I think if you're prepared to say, I regret that these drag queens in the 80s took this broad stride in order to campaign for gay rights, then make that stance, but vote proposition. Because I think that we need to embrace everyone in our queer culture. I think the queer movement necessitates that we have an inclusive and inviting environment. And I think by saying you're too queer is just as bad as saying you're not queer enough. And I think that's what we would fundamentally be doing if we said that we regretted the yassification of the queer movement. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Niamh for that very fine speech, and now cross over a final time and invite Parth Pandya to summarise the debate. Hear, hear.
My favourite colour is also purple, and thank you for some brilliant floor speeches, and thank you everyone, I think, for being quite passionate about the things that they wanted to say. So first of all, I'm going to clarify the stance that I took on my case. So I agree that there should be a balancing. I'm not suggesting that we should suppress queer expression. What I'm saying is that the Western amplification of yassification narratives has caused an oversaturation of these narratives in these countries, and because a lot of queer movements taking time to develop in these countries, often the ability for you to push back against these effects has been unachievable. And I think that that is the thing that I'm trying to explain, is that we should have more of a rebalancing. And I think if someone does want to opt into a feminine or Western aspect of identity that Bonnie says, which I think is completely reasonable, I think that that is still achievable on our side of the house, because Owen is right, those soft power effects would still exist on my side of the house. But the unique thing here is that I don't have to stand over not having ballroom culture, police raves or brutality on my side of the house. What I'm trying to explain is that the worst parts of yassification, the overwhelming nature, the way it's pervaded into the queer movement in totality, is through things like social media, is through the amplification of Western standards and pushing that against people. We all know that a lot of people are stigmatized when they're not coming out, and that is a harmful expectation that we place upon people. So I think that if people want to push back against police raids and brutality, as the speaker at the back said, through subversion tactics, through joy. That is not something that I'm opposing. What I'm saying is that people should have choice into opting into which thing that they would like to do, but often they are often unable to have the agency to make that choice because of the saturation. This is my argumentation. I think that the ballroom culture and the police raids and brutality was really effective, and I think that I agree. I don't disagree with the claims made for the speaker at the back. But it's the fact that in those times, the existence of social media was not there. There was not a decentralization of the movement. So we know that these communities were geographically more isolated through things like gay ghettos, through things like underground movements and things like that, where they had more opportunity to converse with people, to converse with each other about what they think, what their actions should be in the ballroom cultures, in all of the town halls and etc. that they rented. But the decentralization is meant that anonymous people on social media, and often loads of people with power who have never met the people in the countries that they are trying to push these narratives onto, has meant that this is why this is particularly harmful. So I think that what shouldn't just matter is not just history, but the amount Yassification has had an impact. Because sure, it has had an impact throughout the entirety of history, but what I'm trying to defend is that in the last 10 years or so, it's had its largest impact, which is what I'm trying to regret, which is why my argumentation, Owen, is comparative. And I think that is why, I think that Western soft power, even if it's likely to exist, would exist less when it's less saturated on social media. So I don't think that we should be suppressing queer expressions. But positive interpretation is something that's not also something that can only be claimed on the opposition side. For example, there is the Hijra community that I explained. They are very, very positive about their spirituality, but that is a very nuanced perspective that gets pushed away in the mainstream because you have to have that simplistic, low and common denominator, which, by the way, Niamh actually conceded is likely to exist on the Yassification on their side. But instead, what we're having is massive Yassification of gay Hindu gods in India right now, not really an understanding of the situations of class, of the religious identities, the racial identities, etc., all of which are really, really complicated, right? And I think that is something that we need to look at as well. So I think that I agree specifically with what people have said in the floor about not being queer enough, and that sort of narrative which is pushed onto you. But I also want to, and I didn't catch your name, want to talk about the social movements push that someone made and asking about how they adapt, right? This is what I exactly was talking about in my speech. Western NGOs, for example Stonewall, often fund grassroots movements in the developing world. But often, the worst part of it is that they will not fund a movement if they are trying to protest or have like a movement at Pride, for example, when it's Mumbai Pride or whatever, that is a protest with the placards. They'll only fund them if they are going out and celebrating. And this is the harmful stereotype, right? You have to force yourself as a movement to be kowtowing to Western NGO donors for that funding and to be forced into believing that it's a celebration. And this is why it's particularly harmful for these groups who do want to protest. And that's where I explain again that I'm happy for people, if they wish to, push back against police raids and brutality to things like subversion techniques of joy. But actually, this is a good example of when agency is being curtailed because you're relying upon Western actors to give you money for your own movements. But also the commercialization, the lowest common denominator, it has to be positive. As I said, Barclays, NatWest, Santander are not going to fund a movement which is going around protesting these things in the first place, right? So they necessitate it being a celebration in the first place. The reason why the gay movement is commodified so much in comparison to lots of POC movements, lots of trans movements, and arguably lots of feminist movements is because they are more abrasive than the gay movement is in pushing against the societal grain. They are more willing to push societal stereotypes when it comes to these things. It is a queer movement, unfortunately, through the saturation that I've talked about, which is really brushing over a lot of issues which exist through intersectionality. When we think of intersectionality, we think really broadly of feminism, right? That's the first thing that comes into our head. And I think that is the reason why other movements are not as commodified, which is why commodification is particularly harmful. I want to now talk about grassroots versus legislative and social change. Niamh says that grassroots activism is not as important as the mainstream, but note in her speech she talks about Marsha Johnson and taking in kids off the street. That is an aspect of grassroots activism, which I think is particularly important, is these small things which happen at a local scale everywhere around the world, everywhere, in loads of communities, in online forums, and all of these sorts of things. It is the fact that you want representation and feelings of security, feeling just the initial step of, yes, I can reconcile this identity. Otherwise, if you don't have that feeling of representation, if you don't have that grassroots stuff, and you're just bombarded with lots of things like really unimportant reels about, I don't know, denial is a river in Egypt and things like that, that is not actually something that's helpful to someone who's really trying to find their feet, really trying to understand who they are. So grassroots activism is actually really, really powerful, and it's not, it's not something that's particularly very small. It's small in geography, but it's magnified in the amount of times that it happens, and that's why it's really important. Okay, but also, I just want to note that a lot of times in history, when we talk about we don't want to regret the 1980s and 1990s, is what was pushed onto me. A lot of times, the movement against the AIDS movement against the American Psychological Association calling AIDS a GRID, a gay immune disorder and things like that, or Stonewall riots, actually did come through resistance and saying enough is enough, not necessarily through yassification. Yassification happened afterwards when there was more visibility of these things in the first place. So a lot of grassroots or social or legislative action can just actually happen from you being angry about this thing. And I think that if it has to be overwhelmingly positive, as most floor speeches and everyone in this debate has agreed so far, you lose that root of that change in the first place. And oftentimes, in these areas, the way in which you protest the most is because you don't see yourself. I, like me, feel much safer when I see a pride flag above a bar, and I'm more likely to go into it and choose that bar than like another bar. But a lot of these pride flags don't exist all around the world, and that's when the protest starts. That's when Stonewall riots happen, because of the police brutality, them coming in, stopping you from selling alcohol because you're a gay bar, and things like that. And that is what is really important, and that is what safety is about. So, okay, some other things. So, I think that the other thing in this debate and in some of the floor speeches is that we should just say no. But this doesn't really account for the fact that a lot of times there's power dynamics involved. Who gets to control the narrative? Who gets to control yassification? There's not like a focus group of like 1 million people who are fully represented for every ethnic background, every sexual identity and all these sort of things and going, what would you like yassification to look like? No, it's often the people with the most amount of power who are most visible in society. And that tends to be Western individuals with a lot of clout, but also who it tends to be? It tends to be a lot of allies. Like for example, like Taylor Swift giving us her opinion on how she's being an ally this week and all that sort of stuff. So these are the people that have the most amount of power, not just gay people, but often people who are trying to be, I think allies, sorry, to be clear, allyship is really important, and I think most people should be allies, but I think that these are the people that have unique forms of asymmetric power, right? Which means a lot of people can't say no. A lot of people can't say enough is enough, because there's other people that are imposing upon them what that should be in the first place. And I think that is important. But the most successful stuff, I go back to this, the most successful aspects of enough is enough tends to be the most violent, tends to be the most negative aspects of the queer movement, like Stonewall, like the resistance of AIDS, and I think that is. That has been some key turning points, or like marching on the fact that Margaret Thatcher did Section 28 and things like that. So, what else do I want to say? Not really much. I want to agree that I'm so glad that Niamh's grandmother, I think it was it? Yes, watches stuff like Queer Eye and
She's fantastic.
Maybe not Ellen DeGeneres, but but likes things like Queer Eye and things like that. Heavily recommend those shows. But how many of the shows that were listed actually had inputs from directors or executive producers that came from developing countries? I'd argue 0. I mean, RuPaul is obviously a POC, but like a lot of times, these experiences that take place unique in the developing world come through things like structural constraints, cultural context, and things like that. So while we have a massive amount of queer representation and POC representation in the media, often these TV shows don't exist. And often, when I was coming out, I saw a clip of RuPaul's Drag Race, and I was like, well, what is my mum going to think? What is Hinduism going to think? And things like that. And this is exactly the point. We don't have enough of the proliferation of intersectional voices in the movement, which is really important. So, at the end of this debate, there are lots of things to consider and lots of things to cast your vote based on. Whether you care about feeling positive all the time, which, to be honest, I'm just on this side of the motion because I love the UDS and I'm on this side of the motion. I personally think that it's always good to be positive, always good to, to try and push things to joy, because it's a good element of catharsis. And it could be a way to rid yourself of thinking of all the evils in the world. Everything that Niamh said is correct. There's nothing wrong with what Niamh has said, and I think she's done a good job. But what I think is important and something to go back to is that often in the developing countries, due to the amount of saturation, due to the least amount of rights being enshrined in these areas, to the fact that they are so vulnerable, to the fact that we, through globalization, have pushed through narratives which they haven't consented to. Even if they could consent to them, or they do consent to them, we will never know if they did, because we don't have a social contract that's signed by the state, and loads of consent forms that we can have from everyone. So we don't know if this is something that everyone wanted to opt into in the first place. So by all of these fronts, if we care about the 90s and 80s and 1990s, a lot of the countries I'm talking about are still going through that time period. And if we care about those things, then these are the most important people in the debate. Note that a lot of people, like for example the rural American South example, I flagged earlier in my speech. I said, look, Trump is taking away trans rights, we've had Roe versus Wade, and all these sorts of things, all these socially regressive policies that we've had, which is really, really harmful. There are countless examples that exist across the world, but I think that this fundamentally is the example that is particularly important and close to my heart, because oftentimes, these are the people that are forced into like lavender marriages, or what we call glass closet relations, where they're out partially but not out fully. I have a family member who's probably going to end up in a lavender marriage because he didn't get enough information in the first place to understand how to deal with his religious identity in comparison to being gay in the first place, which is really heartbreaking, right? Or indeed me, I was quite lucky in working, in being, inquisitive, in wanting to research more and sort of that sort of stuff. But often you don't get that chance to. A lot of people are vulnerable, and obviously I was born in the UK, so it was much easier for me to do so, even if I was quite religious in general. So I think these are the people that are always going to be harmed by this motion. And if we do care about the 90s, 80s, 1990s, if we do care about queer progression everywhere and around the world, this is the most important thing. So I urge you to side with the proposition.
I'd like to thank Parth for that very fine speech. Now it is time to call the House to vote. So, if you agree and you side with the proposition in the sense that you regret the yassification of the queer movement, please raise your hand now. Nice and high so we can see them. Thank you.
No.
Okay, and if you side with the opposition, as in you don't regret the yassification of the queer movement, please raise your hands now. And any abstentions? Liberals! Wonderful, okay, so before we announce the winner of the Best Floor Speech Prize, and indeed who has won the debate this evening, we would like to do some announcements from board. So I think first of all we'll go to Chair of Ways and Means, Alex.
Hello everyone, my name is Alex from Chair of Ways and Means, which is a very fancy title for saying that I run the public debates. Huge thank you to our speakers, who I begged to speak and nagged them. Parth was very, very helpful. Niamh, I chased once at the union and be like, Niamh! I see a couple of new faces tonight, and I really hope that you enjoyed this debate. Now, the semester is over. That's it, yeah, they're great. The semester is almost over, but don't go yet, because next week we have our Christmas special. We have This House Would Lie to Their Child about the existence of Santa. We'll get some of our wonderful board members to speak on that, and it's going to be great, great fun. We're going to have some kitchen, we're going to have some mulled wine, and we're going to really say goodbye to the first semester with a bang before we all go away in misery to write our exams. Thank you very much.
very much to Alex. Chief Whip is absent from the debate this evening, but Abby, are you happy to?
Yes, Abby!
Thank you. Again, same as last week, I'm not the head of competitive debate, but I do what Alex described as like BP rubbish or whatever, and like, like to think I know what a counterfactual and comparative is and all of that shit. So if you would like to give a speech like Parth, me and some of the floor speakers today, we have one more training left this semester. It's next Wednesday at 2 till 5, top floor of the Union. If you haven't come this semester, we are going to restart in January. There'll be a reintroduction session with Owen. Novices welcome, it's loads of fun. Please come.
Okay, thank you to Abby. Let's go to our steward, Ariel.
Hello, it's me again. First of all, if you enjoyed tonight's debate and you want to have further conversation about this, perhaps with a drink in your hand, please follow us like we do every week and go to the Beacon Bar in the Union. It's at the very top floor. If you've not found it already, you really have been missing out. They've brought back cocktails, yay! Come have a discussion with us. And also, if you haven't been sold enough about the Santa debate, may I also add that we'll be doing a Christmas-themed pub quiz that night as well at the at Beacon Bar. And if you don't attend public, you can still come to the pub quiz. So please come along, get some last socials in before you go on holidays, or as Alex said, to the misery that is exams. I have essays due, so anyway, enjoy.
Wonderful, just a couple of announcements from me this evening and then I promise we'll let you go. So firstly, just to say that thank you to Matilda, who was Diversity and Inclusions Officer, who stepped in for the past couple of weeks as our Sergeant at Arms. Some of you may have noticed on our Instagram that we're having an EGM next Friday, which is Friday the 29th. That's going to be on the top floor of the Union at 4:30 in the small rehearsal room. There'll be more details on that posted, so keep an eye out. The position of Sergeant at Arms is currently vacant. The duties of the Sergeant at Arms are as follows. They sit on the public subcommittee, so the rest of this year, academic year, that looks like working with Alex and Beata, our wonderful public subcommittee, on organising these debates, sending lots of emails inviting speakers, doing what you've seen Matilda model fabulously this evening, which is hold a sword. Yes, exactly. Holding the sword and enforcing the standing orders of the House, which you can see in these order papers here. We are going to be accepting votes by proxy, so the way that you can do that is to email who you would like to vote for to the debates inbox ahead of time. We are going to ask candidates to declare their interest ahead of time so that we can do by proxy voting. So just keep an eye out because that form's going to be coming out on social soon. Sorry? Stereo new Sergeant at Arms. Wonderful. So yes, the EGM is going to be next Friday, top floor of the Union, 4:30 in the small rehearsal room. But yeah, just keep an eye out on our socials because more information is going to be coming out about that. And if you want to hear any more about the role and what it involves, I suggest either speaking to myself, Alex or Beata, and they can give you some more information about what it looks like to be Sergeant at Arms. The second thing is just to say that if you're not on our mailing list, then please come and speak to me after the debate and I can add you on just so you get all the regular updates. And you can follow us on Instagram at STA Debates as well. So we post all of our socials, all of our public debates, everything that we do pretty much, courtesy of Jamie, goes onto our Instagram. Wonderful. So without further ado, I think we should probably announce the floor speech prize for this evening. So Matilda and I decided that we would give the winner of the best floor speech prize to Callie at the back, so congratulations. So if you would come up at the end to collect your prize. And then to announce the winner of the debate this evening. So just a reminder, the debate was that this House regrets the yassification of the queer movement. We had brilliant arguments from both sides of the House this evening. Wonderful speakers, thank you so much for joining us. That being said, the ayes to the right are 24, the nays to the left are 16, and the abstentions were 7. So the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Congratulations. For coming this evening out in the cold to join us, and thank you actually for sharing some of your personal experiences with us. It was a very emotional debate this evening and we really appreciate that you feel comfortable sharing your experiences in this space. It means a lot to us, so thank you all so much and we hope to see you next week.